And certainly people won't miss the most exciting part of this anyway. So thank you everybody for joining. You may have noticed that whilst the event chair is supposed to be Tom Hughes, I am not him. My name is Kim Darrington. I work for the IUA, and we're exceptionally pleased to welcome back Charlotte Warr from Sarnia Training. And she's going to be the main event and the primary presenter for today. I'm simply on hand to potentially answer some questions at the end if required. So there are no planned interruptions, which means I think we normally run this at approximately an hour, don't we, Charlotte?
Yep.
Give or take, depends how many questions you have. Throughout the course of the event, you are more than welcome and, in fact, encouraged to raise questions in the chat, and then we can address those at the end. Or if there is a sensible cut-off point, we might look at them halfway through as well. And with that, I think I'm going to hand you all over to Charlotte so that she can start helping you understand all of the ins and outs of the single claims agreement party arrangements.
Thanks a lot, Kim, and good afternoon to everybody that has gathered around the table today. Because we have our glamorous technical assistant sitting in the background, I am the hopeful expectation that you can now see my slides. And as Kim said, I'm going to walk through the realities of SCAP with you. I'm monitoring both the Q&A panel and the chat panel. So exactly as Kim said, if you've got questions you want to raise, please put them in either of those locations. And there's going to be a couple of places throughout the session where I'm going to be asking you specifically for your views. So there'll be some polling questions that hopefully will come up on the screen. So these are my objectives. I just want to make sure that everybody's clear as to why SCAP was introduced in the first place. And then really for the rest of it, make sure that everybody is in the right place to make sure that it works properly. Because one of the things that is an overriding challenge, I think we'll call it, with SCAP, is that what you have is the intellectual desire of the SCAP clause, but it's not necessarily supported by the technology. There are some limitations to ECF, which mean that because the three versions of ECF are not wholly integrated, they don't completely talk to each other, it's totally reliant, the whole process, on every stakeholder knowing exactly what their role in the process is. So quite simply, what do I do? And what do I not do? And funnily enough, the what do I not do is as important as what do I do, as it were. So as I've said, I will be posting some polling questions. I have no idea who's sitting around the table. I can only see that there are over 100 of you. I don't know, combinations of insurers or brokers or whatever. The answers are anonymous, but as we will see with the questions at the end, it informs the work that Kim is doing, particularly as part of the market modernisation team, as to what might happen in the future with SCAP. So why SCAP? Well, SCAP fundamentally is a leader-only clause. Now, the concept of leader-only is not new in any way, shape or form to anybody who's sitting around the table who's been around for a while. But what this clause was set out to do is deal with the fact that there are a large proportion of claims, and the proportions differ in different classes of business, which really don't benefit for anybody from having more than one pair of eyes look at them. It really is as simple as that. So there is no benefit in terms of customer service of having more than one pair of eyes. There's no benefit in terms of insurer protection, given the assumption that the one pair of eyes knows what they're doing. So let's streamline the claims service, make our market as efficient and effective as it can be. So what makes a claim eligible to be handled under the SCAP protocols? Well, there are both financial criteria and non-financial criteria. So the financial criteria are looking at what is the value of that claim to the participants on that slip that have signed up to SCAP. Now, some of you, I suspect, sitting around the table will be familiar with the Lloyd's market. Not all of you perhaps, but most of you will be. And so, of course, when we're thinking about financial criteria in relation to the Lloyd's rules, there we think about it in the context of the Lloyd's participants. Here we think about it in terms of any insurer of any shape, size or flavour that has signed up to be bound by the SCAP rules. We also look at the net value. So there we take into account any excesses, deductibles, etc. But also, if we're talking about a claim that is poking into the top layer of a tower, whether it be direct or reinsurance, it might be that everything underneath is burnt to toast. But there's only a little bit of claim that pokes into the top layer. That could legitimately, if the financials are sub 250, be SCAP eligible. Okay. Now, of course, we all know that in the first iterations of a claim, there may be no formal numbers posted at all. And so the role of the leader, the slip leader, as I'll call it, the intellectual decision maker, to consider right at the get-go, even if there are no formal numbers, is this a claim that probably will be remaining within the SCAP criteria, or do I think the numbers are going to go above? That's really important, because if there is no formal presentation of numbers, but the leader goes, yeah, this is going to go north of 250, perfectly legitimately go, yeah, we're not going to even put this into SCAP even at this point. In terms of the non-financial criteria, it's basically anything that is the slightest bit messy, really. SCAP is for those straightforward claims that really ought to go through the claims handling cycle without touching the sides, okay? And of course, one example of that would be that there should be no active dispute resolution proceedings. So let's start with our polling question. So glamorous assistant in the background, could I have question 1, please? Now this is for you as a broker. Hopefully everybody can see it. If you can't see it, it's asking you to tell me, if you're a broker, why you're not using SCAP. Is it because you're not aware of it? You don't understand it? Underwriters won't use it? You forget to put it in the slip? The limits are too low to be useful? Or anything else? And if your answer is anything else, can you pop your anything else in the chat, please? So hopefully vote away. Yeah, so if you're not a broker, don't worry about even answering this question. There'll be a question for you potentially in a moment. Okay, so I can't see them. Oh, it's disappeared. Are we going to get the results? There we go. So, okay, so we've got a fair mixture there. And obviously by the end of today, hopefully we will have got rid of the not aware of it and don't really understand how it works. Now, the we forget to put it in the slip, no excuse for that as brokers. It should be built into your slip template. So actually you don't even need to think about it. We'll come back to the underwriters not agreeing to it and the limits being too low in a moment. And then in terms of the any other reasons, there's a couple in the chat which are just about the fact that somebody sitting around the table isn't a broker. So let's have the second question, please, which is for those of you that are insurers. Although the question is posed as an underwriter, it's a question really for insurers. So again, if you can't see it, it's why are you not using SCAP as an insurer or as an underwriter? Because you're not aware of it, you don't know how it works, the limits are too low, you're not comfortable with the slip leads claims team, you have in-house instructions in place not to use it, again, or any other reason. Okay, anybody who is sitting around the table who isn't really in a position to comment on the underwriter's perspective, then feel free just to sit back and drink your cup of tea for the moment. Again, and as soon as we've had a reasonable number of votes, we will see the results. Okay, so again, the not being aware of it and not being sure how it works. Hopefully we can get rid of that by the end of today. We'll come back to the limits point in a moment. Now, the not comfortable with the slip lead claims team. This is a question that I've asked constantly in these sessions since 2020. And I'm still having people saying we are not comfortable with the slip leads claims team. And that's something that I think that can only be resolved at market level, where the insurers have to consider, well, what are the issues? Is it actually not comfortable with the slip lead claims team because you don't know them, or actually you have some conscious awareness of things that are not being done the way that you would like to do it? It's interesting that we're still seeing at least one person saying that there are in-house instructions not to use it. And of course, what that doesn't do is give us an idea of really what's sitting behind that. Okay, so thank you, Glamorous Assistant. Thank you for those of you who voted. So for the brokers sitting around the table, the starting point is, of course, to be aware that it exists. In terms of putting it in the slip, if you're using market reform contracts templates, whether or not you're using version 3 or not, then it's built in to the templates. So actually, there's no real excuse for not having it in there. Now, be mindful that there are some contract structures that you can't use SCAP on. You can't use SCAP on binding authorities. You can't use SCAP on proportional treaties. You can use SCAP on non-proportional treaties. You can use them on XL contracts. That's not a problem at all. Now, what's also important is to understand what type of insurer is entitled to hold the role of the slip leader or the intellectual decision maker, if one wants to call it that. Now, the rules of the game are this. The slip leader can only be a Lloyd's syndicate or a UK authorised insurer. Now, be clear, there can be UK authorised insurers, i.e. authorised by our regulatory framework, that are not IUA member companies. Okay, so that's not a Lloyd's syndicate or an IUA member company. It could be potentially wider than that. Now, the one insurance company, the UK regulated or UK authorised insurer I want to talk about particularly as we go through is Lloyd's Insurance Company, because it is important to understand it is an insurance company. But as we're going to see, it will be called a non-bureau company within the context of SCAP, and I'll tell you why as we go through. There is absolutely no reason why the brokers sitting around the table cannot persuade, encourage overseas markets to agree to be bound by SCAP. And again, one of the disciplines in modern iterations of the slip templates has been to make sure that the totality of the slip clause, the SCAP clause, is actually in the slip, so that overseas markets can actually see what they're signing up to. And then also, of course, to make sure you get the best benefit of it is have those conversations with your claims team, so that if you've got it in the slip and you're hoping that some claims in your portfolio will be done using them, because that's going to be super efficient, that your claims team are on the same page and that they're therefore going to set the claims up to use that mechanism. So what about the choices? Within the Lloyd's market, if the Lloyd's leader agrees to SCAP being in the slip, then any other Lloyd's placement on that same UMR are committed to agree to that. Okay. As far as the company market is concerned, it's every insurer makes their own mind up. And so just because the Allianz has agreed to SCAP being in the slip doesn't mean that the Swiss Re have to. Now, for the brokers sitting around the table, you want to try and get as many people around the SCAP table as you possibly can, but it's important to understand that on the company side, there is no compulsion. Okay. Now, of course, if you do have a situation where you have got some companies in, some companies out, then it starts getting very messy in terms of the claims, and either have very clear slip language to indicate that certain companies are just still agreeing for their own part, irrespective of the operation of SCAP, or potentially have separate slips, separate UMRs, which is just going to be painful at the point of claims. So the headline structure of the claims process is this. Firstly, because of the technology limitations, even though the intellectual decision maker may be very clearly in the slip to be in, for example, the Lerma market, so we'll keep on having Swiss Re as our slip leader, because the three versions of ECF don't really talk to each other, the broker, if they have got Lloyd's security, Lerma security, and ILU security on the risk, still has to shove data down those three pipelines, okay? But a key part of that data has to be the SCAP identifier, the SCAP code. Now, there is no unique field in which this has to go. This has to go as the leading characters in the lost name. And again, it's really important that this is done properly, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I talked about saying things about things you should do and things you shouldn't do. And actually, one of the most important things that you should be doing, if you see something in your workflow and it has the SCAP code on it, and I'll talk more about the codes in a minute, but if you see SCAP L, L stands for Lerma. So if you're in the Lloyd's market, or if you're in the ILU market and it's sitting in your workflow, leave it alone. And that's probably going to be the hardest thing ever to do, because the natural reaction is, it's in my workflow, I need to deal with it. No, don't touch it. It's in your workflow because of the limitations of ECF. All things being equal, as long as everybody plays their part and the wheels stay on the bus, then once the Swiss Re claims team have dealt with it, then the DXC humans and their robot friends will deal with it in the background. And if you're in the ILU market or the Lloyd's market, it will disappear from your workflow. Now, with that in mind, if you're sitting and looking at something in your workflow and you can hear my voice junketing around your head going, leave it alone. Charlotte says, leave it alone. I must leave it alone. And you've left it alone for a healthy period of time, let's say a week, maybe 10 days, and it's still there. That suggests that the wheels have fallen off the bus. And we'll talk about different ways the wheels can fall off the bus in a moment and how you can identify whether that's happened and what you might need to do. So, one of the questions that's often asked is, well, is anybody using it? Does it actually work? Well, yeah, it is being used. There's a healthy number of transactions going through the process. There could and should be more, but there's still a healthy number. And a lot of them work absolutely perfectly. Now, you might look at that 65% and go, that's not a very high percentage. The reality is that actually the humans at DXC are going to have to intervene in certain circumstances in any event, even if everybody has played their part perfectly. But there are some circumstances where the robots should be able to do stuff effectively without human intervention, and they can't. They are prevented from performing their role by humans getting it wrong. So what are humans doing to get it wrong? Well, the first one is it's appeared in your workflow and you've gone, I need to deal with that. So you haven't left it alone, okay? It can also go wrong if the lead is outside the bureau. And therefore that could include the lead being Lloyd's Brussels, where the broker hasn't actually loaded up the lead's comments into the IMR. Okay, then the humans have to intervene. Something as ostensibly straightforward as the SCAP prefix is still causing problems. Because what has to happen is the SCAP prefix has to be at the beginning of the lost name field, which I know is causing some problems for some brokers, particularly batch loaders, where within their own systems, they have it at the end of the field. It has to be at the beginning of the field, and there has to be clear air between the SCAP code and the lost name, because the robots cannot find the SCAP code in a wider group of text. They need to see it freestanding, as it were, okay? And then one of the reasons that's very market specific that the humans need to intervene is particularly at transaction 1 on the Lerma side. There are certain mandatory fields that need to be populated that the human hasn't got a chance to do. Sorry, the robots don't have a chance to do. So if you're a claims person from a broker sitting around the table, the first thing you've got to do is check your slip to make sure that it's in there. Now, we've seen in some of the questions, the polling questions so far, that it might not be in the slip because for some reason it's not in your templates and it's been forgotten to be added. If that's the case, of course, you could try and get it endorsed on, but you probably don't want to be doing that to hold up the claim you're currently trying to deal with. Or you might see that it is in the slip, but underwriters have crossed it out. And they may have crossed it out because they're not prepared to deal with SCAP. And that's an issue that as a claims person, it's too late for you to try and deal with, probably. Let's assume that there isn't a problem, okay? That it is in the slip, it hasn't been scratched out by underwriters, and of course that you are handling a claim on a contract structure where it can be used. So that's effectively open market and line slip business. So we've already talked about the slip leader, the intellectual decision maker, but it is important to identify that there are other parties that have a particular title, if one wants to call them that. So in our example before, we saw the slip leader was in the Lerma market, and therefore they will automatically by default also be the bureau leader for the Lerma market. But if there is Lloyd's market and there is ILU market on that same contract, then there will be nominal leaders for those markets. And of course, it is in their workflow that the claim will also appear and must be ignored in our example that we're using. If you don't fall into one of those categories, so for example, you are part of the Lerma market but not the leader, then you are styled, nothing new particularly about the vernacular, a follower. Now, I just want to pause for a moment on line slips. SCAP can be used in line slips, but be very, very careful, and this is both for brokers and for insurers, for placing and for claims, that you could have a line slip that is led by QBE syndicate. Just because they lead the line slip, it doesn't necessarily mean that they lead every declaration on that line slip. It may be that a declaration to a line slip requires more security than the line slip can offer. And so the line slip security is plumped out, shall we say, with maybe another line slip, maybe open market security, it doesn't really matter. But the key thing is that the line slip itself should indicate who the claims decision makers are and who the slip lead is of that declaration. So let's say that the line slip is led by QBE syndicate, but actually when the declaration is attached to that line slip, the leader of that particular declaration is AIG company. Then when it comes actually to the presentation of that claim, the right combination of insurers must be involved, okay? So I've talked a lot about the code. Let's just remind ourselves what the codes are. Important to remember that it's not L for Lloyd's, it's L for Lerma, I for ILU, S for syndicate, and N for non-bureau. Now, when we talk about non-bureau, what we are talking about is an insurer that does not use ECF. And therefore you might say, well, Charlotte, why are you calling Lloyd's Insurance Company non-bureau? I handle claims for Lloyd's Insurance Company on ECF. Yes, you do. But it's an insurance company, but does not use the company versions of ECF. Okay, that's why effectively it's called non-bureau. And as I said, the really important thing, and this is primarily for the brokers around the table, is that that SCAP code in the loss name field has A, got to be correct, and B, have a space between it and the loss name. And you can see what I mean by this stuff that I'm talking about, that this process, if it's going to work properly, not only has to have sort of intellectual buy-in, but every stakeholder needs to understand the minutiae of their bit of the process so as to make it work. So, first advice, broker looks at their contract, works out what combination of insurers they've got, sends data down whichever combination of ECF pipelines is required. But then if the slip leader is non-bureau, then one of the key documents that needs to be added is the exchange of communications with that non-bureau leader. And you could potentially have a claim which would date back to the early months of 2019, where even on the Lloyd's side, you have some insurers who put an LIC stamp down and some insurers that continue to put a syndicate stamp down. Because if you remember back that far, our departure from the EU was delayed. And so LIC was up and running at the beginning of 2019. But in terms of writing European risks, syndicates should still use their pure syndicate stamps for at least 2 or 3 months. Okay. Now, you see that last point about going forward, all the transactions across all the bureaus must remain aligned. This is a classic example of where wheels can fall off the bus. So if you are sitting looking at your workflow, you are, for example, a syndicate, you're looking at something in your workflow and it says SCAP L, and you go, well, I know that's not me. And it's sitting there and it's sitting there and it's still sitting there after, say, a week or 10 days. Go and have a look in ECF, and you're probably going to have to go into proper ECF. I don't think any of your guide wires or docos or tracks will help you here. Go into proper ECF and have a look at the transactions, because there is a page on ECF where you can see the Lloyd's transactions, Lerma transactions, ILU transactions. If you can see that for the transaction you're looking at on the Lloyd's market, there is no Lerma transaction, then that is going to sit in your waiting list, your to-do list forever and a day. If, however, you can see that there is a Lerma transaction, but the Lerma leader hasn't yet responded to it, well, at least that tells you why yours is still sitting in your to-do list. And it's important to understand that right from the get-go of this, Lloyd's gave a confirmation that if it was a Lloyd's bureau leader, that they would not be looking at any timelines in terms of turnaround for things sitting in your workflow, because they're sitting in your workflow for reasons that are outside your control, okay? But particularly if you can see that there is no Lerma transaction, so there's nothing for the slip leader to respond to, contact the broker, email them, call them if necessary, and just try and do something. If necessary, you can query the transaction because they are out of sync. So in terms of who decides whether it's a SCAP claim, well, the opening salvo effectively is going to be from the brokers, because you're going to be presenting the claims to insurers and you're going to say, we believe this claim falls within the SCAP criteria. And something I should have mentioned earlier on, of course, is the SCAP criteria are set in sterling. But if you've got a claim that's denominated in another currency, then the SCAP rules say that you have to go and look at the Bank of England's spot rate for the day on which you present the claim to insurers, and use that as the rate of exchange, and insurers should use that as well. But actually, the final decision about whether a claim is in the first instance eligible for SCAP or whether it stays within the SCAP process is with the slip leader. And it is important to understand actually that claims can move out of SCAP. They can theoretically move into SCAP as well, but it's probably moving out of that is the more relevant. So a claim could start looking fairly straightforward, small in value, benign in nature, and then something could happen. You know, the numbers could pop up, something weird come out of left field, making it just a bit more messy. And then at that point, slip leader, message back to the broker, this claim is no longer eligible for SCAP. All the broker needs to do is go back into the class transactions, take the SCAP code out of the lost name field, re-release all the class transactions again, and they will go back to being handled under the, shall we call them, traditional rules. So Lloyd's CLA or the IUA claims handling guidelines. Now, what of course that's going to mean for those of you, carry on using our example that it was a SCAP L, that are in the Lloyd's market or the ILU market, yes, you're suddenly going to find yourself getting involved in a claim that you have not been thus far. So you're going to have to read into it. But that is, again, really no different for you on the Lloyd's side from a claim being made complex partway through its life. Now, strictly speaking, according to the granular detail of the SCAP clause, slip leaders should also be on the lookout for claims that are presented to them not under the SCAP rules that they believe actually are eligible and therefore should be handled under the SCAP rules to make it more efficient. Now, I am seeing that happening occasionally, not seeing that happening very much, but I'll leave you just to think about that. So, it appears on the slip leader's desk. They look at it, they go, yeah, happy that that falls within the criteria of SCAP. Then you just deal with it the same as you would deal with any claim. And of course, it may be that you're going to query that transaction, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It may be that you agree that transaction, but the key thing is you just do your normal thing. Everybody else, leave it alone. Okay, and as I've said, if all the wheels stay firmly on the bus, as soon as the leader has responded, DXC, either through a combo of humans and robots, will respond for the other markets, and it will disappear from your workflow. Now, for any of you, if it appears in your workflow saying SCAP NB, you can all ignore it, because DXC will deal with it on behalf of everybody in the background, as long as the brokers have loaded up the non-bureau leaders' comments. So, there are some things that are going to be going on in the background. Obviously, DXC will be doing the responses on ECF. For those of you in the Lloyd's market, if it's a SCAP claim, then a SCAP cause code actually will be put onto XCS class and then come out on the overnight message. But then there will also be a SCAP notification report that comes out to various combinations of carriers that gives you visibility, particularly if you're not part of the decision-making process, as to what's going on, and also allow you to do some of your own checks as well. So the notification report comes out every day, and it's a snapshot. It's not a cumulative report. Okay, so you've got to keep on top of this as a carrier. And it's going to, for example, be sent to those of you that are company market that are non-lead. So it gives you immediate visibility. Okay, what's happened? What transactions? You know, for example, have they been queried? I've talked a lot about the robot. So what does the robot actually do? Well, the first thing that the robot does is, if it can identify something as being SCAP, and remember, it needs firstly a code to be there and the code to have spaces after it so it can see it clearly, then it will divide up that pile of claims into two pots. Things it can deal with by itself and things it needs its human friend to help it with. So if the robot can deal with it by itself, it will obviously check the SCAP name to see where the decision-making power lies. It will, if it's SCAP L, right, let's go and check the Lerma transaction to see, was it a positive response, was it a query response? And it will check for the existence of documents at both levels in the filing cabinet, attached to the UCR and at the UMR. It doesn't take a genius to work out that in this context, the robot can't read the documents. Okay, obviously some robots can, this one can't. So where it's going to ask its human to help is if it's coming in as slip lead NB, somebody needs to read the non-bureau leader's responses that would have been loaded hopefully up into the IMR. If it is a Lerma bureau first advice, then those of you, of course, who work on the Lerma side know this, then you've got the mandatory fields of the business class and the subclass, etc., that the robot can't do for itself. And then any time that there's a problem with the SCAP loss name. So this is where the robot thinks that it's SCAP, but it's not entirely sure. It'll go to its human, okay? So in terms of what the human is going to do, the human obviously is going to start by doing exactly the same things that the robot does, but adding on reading some stuff. So where the robot is going to be going, right, we've got a problem, and it's going to spit into having the human dealing with it, is where the process hasn't been followed properly. So we've already talked about not leaving it alone. Also, not leaving it alone and querying it. So pend is query effectively in the ILU context. If there's no documents, the robot can see that there's no documents, but refers it to its human to go, what's going on? And then bizarrely, and it has happened, if the SCAP name is actually different on different transactions. Now, it might be typos, it might be an attempt to put spaces in where they weren't before. There's all sorts of reasons why there could be problems. But it just means that the end-to-end, beautiful, clean, streamlined, not touching the sides using the robots process just doesn't work. So as I've said, what the human will be doing is, again, checking the slip leads comments, checking for documents, but also in certain circumstances, of course, reading those documents. And if it is SCAP NB and the non-bureau leaders documents aren't on the file, then DXC will query the transactions. So as a leader coming out of any market, you handle the claim as you would normally do, and you are empowered to do pretty much what you would normally do. So it's important to understand that you can decline claims. But if we think about the non-financial criteria for things coming out of SCAP, of things that are complex or controversial, and particularly with the active dispute resolution proceedings, it's up to you as a leader to go, does the mere fact of the declinature mean that I think it should come out of SCAP? You know, if it's a routine sub-deductible type declinature, then no, it doesn't need to come out of SCAP just because of that. If you're looking at bordereau, now remember, binding authorities can't use SCAP, but line slips can, and you can have line slip bordereau. The aggregate value of the bordereau can be huge, but as long as every line item on the bordereau is sub 250, you're good to handle it as a leader. And the same in terms of dealing with lost funds or escrows. Those are admin activities. They're not pure claims handling activities. So in terms of coming out of SCAP, the broker or the insurers can trigger that conversation. There's no reason why a broker can't say, you know, we believe this claim is no longer eligible for SCAP. And in terms of how it's done, it's very simplistic. The SCAP loss name is just removed from the loss name in field in broker class. And what that means is that when that claim pops up in people's workflow, it will obviously not have any sniff of SCAP about it. And in whosever workflow it turns up in, they're going to have to deal with it. Now, it is entirely possible that a claim could start out as not being SCAP, but then go into SCAP. But it's important to understand that it can't go into SCAP if it wasn't there originally without all existing decision makers agreeing. It is not a scenario where the slip leader can suddenly universally disenfranchise everybody else just because they think it's a good idea. So let's look at some FAQs. So for those of you that are brokers, I've already talked about the fact that transactions remain fully aligned. Now, this is actually quite problematic because the different versions of ECF have different functionality. So, for example, if you're answering a query on a transaction in the Lloyd's version of ECF, you don't answer it by loading in a new transaction. You have to resolve the query transaction, either by correcting data and re-releasing, or in certain circumstances, which is entirely appropriate, deleting that transaction. Whereas in Lerma, once a transaction's been circulated, you can't amend the data as a broker. So if there is a query, your response has to be an additional transaction. So just think about that if the matter is within SCAP, because those transactions need to stay aligned, the same number of transactions for each separate market. We've talked about taking a claim out of SCAP, so I don't need to repeat myself there. Now, in terms of parallel UCRs, then it's more about alignment than anything else. So if the master claim that you are obviously hooking your parallel UCR into is being handled under SCAP, then absolutely you can set the parallel UCR up as SCAP, but you can't otherwise, okay? For those of you on the ILU market, you'll be mindful of the fact that in certain circumstances, it will be two ILU leaders that will agree to things. If a transaction comes through to you and you are the slip leader, so it's SCAP I, then if the second ILU box is ticked, that you can see that, then untick it. Then, and this is the same for all insurers, if there is anything positive coming up on the sanctions side, then that claim comes immediately out of SCAP. And then also if there are Medicare issues, that just brings in a bit of complexity. Now, with Lerma, I just want to talk about the lead reserve field. Now, the lead reserve field in Lerma, of course, is not freely visible to other carriers. And so what you've got to think about is if the broker is presenting a reserve of X to all markets, and it's a SCAP L, so you're looking at it as the intellectual decision maker as Lerma, where you might normally say, no, I'm not going for X, I'm proposing a lead reserve of Y. Well, then your other two market participant friends in the Lloyd's market and the ILU market can't see Y. They have no visibility of Y. And so you've got a mismatch, okay? So try not to use it. If you do want to use it for whatever reason, then you need to think about actually communicating with the other markets. Now, one of the reasons for being really quick on the draw in terms of looking at the SCAP notification report, particularly as a Lerma follower, is this does give you the opportunity to object to something that the leader has done, but you've got to be quick. Now, there is a radio button in the Lerma version of ECF, which is called contractual condition applies. And the three options, yes, no, and small claim. And the default is no. And when you're dealing with a SCAP claim, leave it as no. Okay. Now, anybody who was really heavily involved in using SCAP right at the get-go will know that the original instructions were to move it to yes. They were rescinded fairly quickly. So you leave it as no because the robots are going to be doing their stuff in the background. Now, for Lloyd's, you also have lead reserve fields, of course, in ECF, but they can be used for two different things. You can use them, and indeed you should use them still, for splitting a broker's reserve, which will be an aggregation potentially of indemnity and experts, into its constituent parts. You should not use it to override the broker's presented reserve. So the same comment really as I talked about to the Lerma market. Exactly the same with sanctions and Medicare. That is bringing in a sniff of complexity, so take it out of SCAP. And then in terms of mandatory fields and fields that you need to deal with in ECF, there are a number of them still that you need to address. So comments remain still very important in the context of ECF. And remember that different types of comments are visible by different combinations of stakeholders. Public comments visible to everybody in all versions across all markets, including the broker. But when we're talking about the private comments, they have a much more limited visibility, and basically they are inside the market segment visibility only, and of course are not visible to the broker at all. Now, if you are the SCAP leader, you are at liberty to query a transaction. That's absolutely fine. For everybody else, it will appear on the notification report as a line item that has been queried, so they have a sense of where it is. And the broker should address that query in the normal way and just be mindful of if the SCAP leader is Lerma, where the normal way to address a query is to add in a new transaction. Think, well, actually, I'm going to have to put in new transactions across all the other markets as well, so we stay parallel. So just to reinforce the fragility, shall we say, perhaps, of the process, if people don't understand the key steps that need to be taken, please, 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 as brokers, make sure that the SCAP code is correct, is in the right place in the lost name field, and has a space between the code and the lost name. Please, please, please don't, I was going to be rude there, push your luck. The SCAP clause is set up for claims that are sub 250. That will be a question in a minute. But right from the get-go, there were some market sectors who went, we don't get out of bed for that amount of money. We want to use more. The robots are not capable of checking the values. And so if a SCAP claim goes through where a value is higher than 250 and either the leader misses it or consciously buys into abusing the process, then there is going to be no second pair of eyes to pick that up, okay? But if the robots only are involved. If the humans at DXC get involved, then at least they can see that. We've already talked about leaving it alone. We've already talked about the broker forgetting to put non-bureau lead comments in the folder. Different transaction numbers different numbers of transactions for different markets, that causes problems. And then we've already talked about the SCAP names. Now, really good question coming in from somebody who is both Lloyd's and companies. But for a question on the Lloyd's side, can Lloyd's still use the lead fee reserve to set a fee reserve where the broker has not included it in the reserve and no parallel UCR has been set up? If you are the leader in a SCAP role of a mixed market, no, you can't, because the other markets won't have visibility of that fee reserve that you've put in, okay? So just in case you want bedtime reading, and I think it will come out with the materials from this session as well, you read the clause. It is reasonably long. It's about 6 pages long, but there are guidance notes as well. And then there are a huge amount of Q&A documents that were produced early on when we started doing these market refreshers actually at LMG level. So now I've got a couple more questions. So Glamorous Assistant, if I could have polling question number 3, please. This is for everybody, brokers and insurers. Oh no, Glamorous Assistant has gone to sleep. Oh no, he's woken up. So hopefully you can all see the question. If you can't, let me read it out to you. The question is quite simply, what would you want changed to increase your usage? Because you haven't got the excuse of not knowing about it or not knowing how it works now. Higher limits, more comfort about other insurers' claims teams, visibility of stats about whether it's actually working, there are improved turnaround times, hard evidence of no customer or insurer detriment, or anything else. And if you're answering anything else, then please put your thoughts into the chat. So vote now. Okay, that's probably enough time for people to make their choice and tap the button. Oof. Okay, so nobody's particularly all right. So there's a comment come in that says that they'd be interested in a mix of evidence around current statistics mixed with no evidence of detriment to insureds, and if it all looks positive, suggested increase to 500,000, which I'll take to be sterling. Okay, that's useful. Thank you very much. And if we could have our last question, please. So the reason for this question is that LIBA actually did put forward a formal request to the RUA and the LMA that the SCAP limits be considered to be increased to 1 million to bring it in line with the changes in the Lloyd's claims lead arrangements, whereby the lowest level for claims to be handled by one pair of eyes was up to 1 million. Now, the request came in during last year at a time where obviously, certainly in the Lloyd's market, there was a lot of work being done about just trying to embed the new Lloyd's rules. So I think there was an element, and I'll defer to Kim on this, of a bit of kicking the can down the road. So whilst people are answering the question, Kim, where are we with that at the moment?
It's a large piece of work. We could simply raise the limit to 1 million, put it straight into the clause. It would only work going forwards because the clause has to be on the slip and subsequently follows through to the claims. But we did actually poll our members, and we don't have universal enthusiasm for raising. There are multiple reasons for that. One of them, I think, is that they find the current system a bit clunky. We've discussed it. It's not the refined Rolls-Royce of solutions. It's the best we can do with the tech that's in place. And so obviously promised very soon is new digital coming through Velenetic, which would allow a smoother user experience in all aspects, but certainly when looking at this particular item too. Now, obviously, unfortunately, that has been knocked back a couple of times, but it definitely would facilitate user experience when doing this. And another reason is that some of our members do, as you've seen through your polls, have some issues in being comfortable around delegating entirely to another claims team that sits outside of their company. And then there is lastly also some uncomfortability around sanctions checking and rapid respond to sanctions checks in the same way that they can now. I think a lot of these can be solved with tech, not the current tech, especially as we're planning right now to get off it. So that was part of the reason for the delay. And also we need to make sure that immediately raising the limits doesn't simply mean that what you gain at the top end, you lose bottom end because people are now no longer willing to be part of the SCAP scheme. So it's a marked movement, and we really do need Lloyds to be fully engaged through the LMA. And we need to work away with our members so that it genuinely progresses the position of SCAP and doesn't just simply change a number, almost arbitrarily thinking that it will capture more when in actual fact it potentially might not.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there's a very good question come in where I don't have enough visibility of the minutiae of how ICOS, or whatever the new vernacular is for it. When SCAP was first released, it was made clear in initial training that putting SCAP in the lost name was a temporary workaround. Yes, I remember that. It's been going on for a long time, alterations and updates. Yeah, we're aware of that. So do we have the detail yet, Kim, of how SCAP claims are going to work through ICOS?
Day one of phase one, exactly as they do now.
So still requiring the SCAP lost name to be put in there.
However, the ambition is definitely to move towards a situation whereby the robot is able to identify the value of the claim and able to understand if SCAP is in the slip and is able to present it as a potential SCAP claim. Now, as you said, all of the triggers are not hard triggers. Some of them are much more subjective or objective. So you can't ask a robot to do 100% of that job, but you can ask it in the first instance, I think, to say this claim is below 250 to this slip. This slip contains the SCAP clause. You could potentially, and hopefully route it to the slip lead who could say yes, agree, or no, disagree, and that would essentially cause workflow subsequent to that. Again, because you have to route it to the slip lead and they would have to make the actual agreement, it's not the technology isn't really the problem, it's the process. It's the idea that people would have to do these things on behalf of each other as a market, and that there would have to be an entirely new thought process that goes to manage SCAP claims, which in the wake of a massive technology change, which moving to one will be, is perhaps not the right time for it. So the tech is most of the way there. The market needs to get us the rest of the way there, and that's a huge job which the IUA is going to be part of undertaking.
So we will. So the short answer there is we will wait and see.
Yes. Short answer is no mind whatsoever.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions coming in on the chat, which I'll just deal with, and then we'll look at the answers. So question coming in: what should we do as a non-agreement party if we get a sanction hit on a settlement? So if you are a LERMA a non-agreement party, that's when within the 1 day you should trigger the stop to stop your money going out. Are you asking that? I mean, I can see who's asking the question. Are you asking as Lloyds or company? Do you want to just quickly pop that in, and then I'll deal with your other question. And the other question is about ICOS again and about parallel UCRs. So certainly the early suggestion was that parallel UCRs wouldn't exist anymore, because obviously the whole idea of ICOS is it's very much more insurer centric. And obviously there's Gemini as well. Where are we with parallel UCRs at the moment, Kim?
I'm feeling a little bit like I'm on repeat, but the short answer again is absolutely no change. Again, the actually support this even in phase 1, which would be the removal of parallel UCRs and the ability to append the main claim record with the expert fee reserves and financial movements. The reason that has not been implemented in this phase is because of messaging and the relay of that information amongst parties, and basically the way that information is triggered to be sent and the format which it is sent at the moment doesn't support that. It means that, for instance, if you were using back, you wouldn't be able to see that because there's no trigger for the carrier to send right back messages, for the centre to send right back messages. So essentially, it will change very soon after we move into phase 2. Immediately, no change, parallels remain.
Okay, thank you, that's really helpful. And so the query about the non-agreement party, if you get a sanction hit on a settlement, if you're in Lloyds, that's a good one, because I'm actually not sure what you can do. That might be a real issue, actually. If it hasn't been picked up as a sanctions issue, they're fairly hot on it. You pick it up as a standalone issue on the Lloyd's side, and it's not, particularly if you're, for example, following a Lerma lead, and they haven't flagged it as a sanctions issue. I think the only thing is going to be that notification report is checking it and flagging it to make sure that the money doesn't go through central settlement.
Yeah, I think your best move would be called split plead.
Yeah.
And get them to cancel the transaction or have the transaction held.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for everybody that has put up questions, and be happy in the knowledge that, given that hopefully there aren't going to be any more delays, you are possibly attending the final ever IUA SCAP refresher, where we're talking about the use of ECF. So enjoy that moment in the sunshine. Thank you to Kim for hosting. Thank you for all the questions that you have posed, and also answering my Ask the Audience question. The will be made available to you together with the supporting material. And all I would say is just keep engaged with everything that's going on within the market, so you have visibility as to what's going on. And other than that, I'll give you several minutes back in your life to do wise and wonderful things with.